Hey guys, appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. As always, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. The Polymagetic, you'll see it down there in the corner underneath the screen. You'll see appreciate you taking the time to do that. And I want to offer some thoughts here about the current story that's being thrown all around the media right now. A very significant story with the killing of RAYSHARD Brooks. RAYSHARD Brooks in Atlanta. We all know about this occurred, what was it, 5 nights ago on the 12th, I believe, in Atlanta, Georgia. And there was a Wendy's there where he was shot in the parking lot. Everybody's seen the story. I'm sure everybody's pretty familiar with what's going on so far. And in the case, we see, if you look, there's a whole lot of things that have come out since it developed, since the 5 nights ago. But basically, Mr. Brooks ended up in the drive-through of the Wendy's, and and one of the employees inside, a lady, called 911. You can hear that. It's on. You can hear that call. They put that online, and you can hear her call in and say there was a gentleman in a car blocking her drive-through, and she tried to wake him up. I believe she said, and she could not wake him up, so she went back in and called the drive-through, or called the 911 rather, and they responded to come out there. 911 comes out. Police come out. They wake him up, get him to move his car to a parking spot there on the property, and they go to engage him and talk to him and ask him what's going on. We all know what happens. Eventually, he got into a scuffle with the police and ended up leading to Mr. Brooks being shot and killed. And so I wanted to offer some thoughts that I've kind of looked at along the way. I don't claim to be the standard. I'm not a police officer. I didn't used to be a police officer. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a lawyer of any sort, haven't had any formal training in law. Like many of us out here, all I've learned is by just trying to gather information as it's being released to the general public. That's pretty much how I'm learning. I do have a few friends who are law enforcement officers who do work in that field and do have some experience, and I've tried to receive input from them as far as their perspective on what Officer Rolfe and Officer Brosnan were allowed to do on a general level as police officers. Of course, you have specifics in the county and the city that may differ amongst departments and all that. And so you look in the story here, you see today that the charges were released against Garrett Rolfe, Officer Rolfe. And this is Alive 11. I've been kind of following them through this because that's a local Atlanta channel, TV station that's been broadcasting a lot of the information that's been being released. And I try to go to the closest hometowns if I can, because they're going to be more specific on a lot of things because they're a local channel versus a nationally syndicated. And so anyway, 11 total charges, including felony murder. I barely highlighted, but felony murder. That's a very heavy charge. Worst case scenario, Officer Rolfe is looking at the death penalty. He's not going to get the death penalty. That's a very unrealistic. It's not impossible, but highly unlikely. He could get life in prison with felony murder charge as well. And so what I want to look at though is that here's my 2 cents on what I've seen so far in this video and in this case with Garrett Rolfe and RAYSHARD Brooks. We all have seen this. I'm sure many of us are familiar with this scene by now. This is the security camera. It's on the building on the side of the Wendy's, looking down into the parking lot. You can see all the cars here in the drive-through. And this part that's been released so far is after there. Here's the 2 police vehicles over here. I'm going to point the arrow off screen, but if you look at some of the other videos, you'll see that you'll be able to tell that the 2 officers and Mr. Brooks are generally in this area right here. You can see the parking spots coming up right here. He was parked somewhere up here, and they just had him pull off into a parking spot over here in this area. Can't go off the screen, but it's over in this area on this side of the police vehicles. They pulled up, and they're talking here, and this is where they got into a scuffle. This is where the officers attempted to handcuff Mr. Brooks, and then he started resisting and fighting him. You can watch the videos. He apparently hits one of the officers. I think it was Officer Rolfe. He might have punched him in the face there. And then in the process, he took the taser. I believe it was Officer Brosnan's taser, if I'm not mistaken. But that you can check that out. But either way, he grabbed the taser off one of the officers. He runs up here, and you're going to see what's happened. I'm going to play this real quick just for you to watch. There they go. Right there. And this is where the camera stops. And this is about the part where he drew the weapon. And then this is the TV station, I believe. Yeah, 11 Alive. They may have paused it right there for viewer censorship, just to make sure they didn't show them actually shooting him, because this is about where he gets shot in the right here. And he falls down right in this spot here, roughly. And so here comes Mr. Brooks running out. He breaks loose from the officers and he runs out, and he's running away, right? And the guy has a taser in his hand at this point. You can see the taser right there. Okay. That's that bright spot on the screen by his body. And here comes Officer Rolfe following him with his taser. That's why I said I believe this was Officer Brosnan's taser, because Officer Rolfe had already fired his taser on Mr. Brooks. I believe he used it twice from what I've heard, which means he had a multi-round taser. Some of the tasers now, from a friend of mine was telling me, now I don't know what Atlanta issues to their officers, but I do know now you have some tasers out there that can have 3 rounds they can fire before you have to use a dry stun. We have to push it to the body itself, direct contact. And so he used two rounds. So I'm assuming Officer Brosnan had a similar taser or the same model. But either way, I don't know conclusively. But he is holding his taser out in front, tasing him at this point. It's having no effect. And apparently he used it twice, is what I'm reading so far. And so as he's running off, you'll see Mr. Brooks is going to turn around and he points right there. Perfect stop point. Perfect stop point. That's what I wanted to stop on it too anyway. RAYSHARD turns around at this point, well, turns sideways at least, poises his torso sideways enough to where he can point his arm back. He points the taser at at Officer Rolfe, definitely within range. And he fires the taser to Officer Rolfe. And you can see the little burst coming out the end, the little sparks coming out from the explosive device that fires out the taser, the prongs that go out and attach to the body. Now, I believe they missed Officer Rolfe. He did not report at all in his body cam footage that he was hit. I believe Officer Brosnan says he thinks he may have been hit, but it bounced off of him or something like that. Either way, they weren't tased. That's the point. But Mr. Brooks did, obviously you can see, fire the taser upon him. So as he goes right there, that's where Officer Rolfe draws his weapon now, and he fires it into the back. He hits Mr. Brooks in the back twice. I believe he fired 3 rounds. 2 of them hit Mr. Brooks in the back. And so you can look at this video and clearly see, boom, right there. And then right there is where he drops his taser. You can see that. You can see Officer Brooks, or Rolfe rather, drops his taser out of his hand so he can grab his pistol in his hand and fire it. Because at that point, he said, hey, this guy, I guess he's assuming he realized the guy that Mr. Brooks had at that point fired the taser. So he's moving to a higher level of force, right? You always step up when it comes to use of force. You want to be one ahead of those who you're interacting with. You don't want especially in this case, if you're trying to arrest somebody, you don't want them having force over you. You have to make sure that you have force over them. So if they raise the level up to using a taser, you have to do something above a taser. And so that's where once he dropped it once he fired it, he dropped his taser and said, well, I got to go higher. And he grabbed his gun. And that's where he used the gun. Now, the issue comes down to, and this is where it's going to come down to, was he justified in using that? Now, we have to remember, this is not, because there's times where, I agree there's times where people do things. It doesn't mean that it's right to do. I get that. But if we're going to a courtroom, we have to judge things by what the law says. It can't just be by, well, the law says he could have done that, but he shouldn't have, because that was not really a right thing to do. Well, you can't penalize somebody in a court of law on what they just should have done based on a personal conviction of moral behavior or some other standard. The standard is the law that's on the books. That's what we got to judge by, correct? And the police department, if he violated their code or if he violated their rules, they can fire him or punish him as an employee. But when we look at this situation here, Mr. Rolfe pulled his gun out and fired upon RAYSHARD Brooks once RAYSHARD Brooks fired the taser upon Officer Rolfe. Let me go back here. Once he fired the taser back on Officer Rolfe. You see that right there? And so the question becomes, was he justified in doing that? Again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an attorney. I don't know the detailed specifics that they do. So I'm not saying, hey, this is the final decision coming from Steve, because I'm not a judge anyway, in the eyes of the law. So I can't give, that kind of rule, but I can tell you
Crohn's
what I
is
think.
more than a bathroom disease.
And whoops.
Nausea.
Weight loss.
Fatigue.
I don't know why this did that.
Reduced appetite.
Fever.
Anyway,
Abdominal pain.
Damaging inflammation.
we'll just get past that. Sorry about that. And so there you go. Free add-on Crohn's disease there. So anyways, so here's a question. Here's some things I wanted to look at right quick. Because it comes down to this point, was he justified to shoot that gun? Now, I've heard people saying things like, well, Mr. Howard, the prosecuting attorney, the DA there, said that Paul Howard, he was saying that in the video, someone's car video, one of these cars here, in the videos on one of their phones, it shows Officer Rolfe kick Mr. Brooks while he was on the ground after he fell prone after being shot. And, that's a separate issue. If he kicked him after he was down, that's a separate issue to was he justified to shoot. You can't really bring those two together and say, well, he shouldn't have shot him because he kicked him later on. That's after the fact. So that's two separate things. Just like the idea of should he have rendered first aid or CPR sooner than later. That's a separate matter than was he justified in shooting him. If he did not render CPR like he ought to have, if he did kick him in a way that was inappropriate or unlawful, then those things can be charged separately. But was he charged or was he justified in using his gun to shoot Mr. Brooks when Mr. Brooks fired the taser upon him? So here's a couple things to think about. Number one, under the Atlanta Police Department, this is a policy manual. You can get this online, just like I did. This was updated June 7th. So this was 5 days before Mr. Brooks was shot. And under this code here, this is their standard operating procedure. You see this here for the Atlanta Police Department, just to make sure you see what's going on here. There's Chief Erica Shields, who's now resigned. Remember, she resigned, I think it was less than 24 hours after this incident. Under this policy, I'm scrolling down here. Here's page 2. Here's section 411. Employees are expressly prohibited from the unnecessary or unreasonable use of force against any person or property. Now remember, this is for the Atlanta Police Department. Okay. Look at 412. Employees will only use that force which is reasonable and necessary to effect an arrest. In other words, you use what is only necessary to secure this man. Don't go above and beyond. You're not allowed to do that, right? So they will only use that force which is reasonable and necessary to effect an arrest, prevent an escape, necessarily restrict the movement of a prisoner, defend the officer or another from physical assault, or to accomplish other lawful objectives. All right. Now, keep that in mind. Let's come down here, and I would encourage you all to read this. There's 8 pages here. There's a lot to read, but I'm not going to read through it all at this point, just to kind of get down to it. Look at 4.2, use of deadly force. You see that? Here we go. Now watch, folks. An employee may use deadly force, like a gun, may use deadly force to apprehend a suspected felon only when. Now, at this point, is Mr. Brooks a suspected felon? Well, yeah. How do we know that? The fact that he laid hold of, well, first of all, he assaulted an officer. He grabbed his taser and then fired it. He's done multiple counts at this point. Firing a taser on an officer's own taser, just grabbing the taser itself. You grab an officer's taser, you grab his gun, that's a felony. You can't do that. So the point being here, though, is that an employee may use deadly force to apprehend a suspected felon only when, here's the only time, according to the definition of the Atlanta Department Police Policy Manual right here, you can only use deadly force when he or she, let me just start it from the top. An employee may use deadly force to apprehend a suspected felon only when he or she reasonably believes, that is, when the employee, or the officer, Rolfe in this case, only when he reasonably believes that the suspect possesses a deadly weapon or any object, device, or instrument which, when used offensively against a person, is likely to or actually does result in serious bodily injury, and when he or she reasonably believes that the suspect poses an immediate threat of serious bodily injury to the officer or others. Let's stop there because we're not done yet, but on that part right there. So it's going to come down to, Did Officer Rolfe reasonably believe that Mr. Brooks possessed a deadly weapon? Okay, that's going to require definition in the courtroom. What's considered a deadly weapon? Does a taser count as a deadly weapon? Because it says if he reasonably believes that the suspect possesses a deadly weapon or any object, device, or instrument which, when used offensively against a person, like you fire it at an officer, is likely to or actually does result in serious bodily injury. So that's going to come down to a big point of concern. Is the taser a deadly weapon? Is the taser a device or instrument which, when used offensively against a person, can cause, or actually, it says, is likely to or actually does result in serious bodily injury? Could that have happened to Officer Rolfe when firing a taser upon him? Could it have led to, or did it actually result in him receiving serious bodily injury? And so that's one thing that has to be taken into consideration. And so I want to point out one thing here under Georgia Code Title 16-11-106. You can look this up for yourself. Again, I'm no lawyer, I'm no attorney or anything like that. I just look this stuff up on my own and try to listen to what others are saying and trying to find the details of it, because that's what I want to do, is just let's get down to the facts here and the data and how is this going to play out? I don't know Officer Rolfe. I don't know RAYSHARD Brooks. I really have no reason to side with either one of these guys. I'm trying to find out, what is the bottom line here? Again, I won't be able to probably get to it on my own because we're going to have to wait till this is hashed out in court as well. That's going to be the ultimate day of decision right there, as far as the legal aspect is concerned. But notice this, under Georgia Code Title 16-11-106, it says here, for the purposes of this code section, notice this, the term firearm shall include stun guns and tasers. A stun gun or taser is any device that is powered by electrical charging units, such as batteries, and emits an electrical charge in excess of 20,000 volts, or is otherwise capable of incapacitating a person by an electrical charge. So any person who shall have or within arm's reach of his or her person a firearm, taser, or a knife having a blade of 3 or more inches in length during the commission of or the attempt to commit a crime against or involving the person of another, and these other two options as well, examples or cases, any person who has one of these things in their reach, who has a taser, let's say, and uses it in a crime involving the person of another, that person, and which crime that is a felony, commits a felony. So you can use this taser, you can use a taser and use it in an act of a felony, it says right here. But the point of being that I'm going to zero in on is the fact that under Georgia Code, a stun gun or a taser is considered as a firearm. Now, how is that going to play into matter of things? We'll have to see. But there's some few thoughts I want to bring up in just a minute. But notice this, back to the Atlanta Police Department policy manual. And the employee can also use deadly force to apprehend a suspected felon only when what? When there is reasonable or when there is probable cause to believe that the suspect has committed a crime involving the infliction or threatened infliction of serious physical harm. And that has to be defined, of course, serious physical harm. And the employee reasonably believes that the suspect's escape would create a continuing danger of serious physical harm to any person. Now remember, we don't know exactly the situation that's going on, only any more than what's been revealed to us so far. But people have to, what's going to be taken into account is the fact that, was Mr. Brooks intoxicated? Yes. But did Mr. Brooks admit to being intoxicated? Yeah, he did. Matter of fact, he kind of was back and forth on his story, giving contradictory reports, and that's going to create a problem for his case. But that's going to be dealt with in court once again. The point here is that, was it possible, or was there probable cause for Mr. Rolfe to believe that Mr. Brooks would be able to escape and commit harm, or he could create continuing a danger, or he could escape and create a continuing danger of serious physical harm to any person? Well, he showed himself to be physical when the officers went to handcuff him. He immediately became physical. He was very compliant up to that point. The situation de-escalated rather rapidly. For about 20 minutes or so, Mr. Brooks was very compliant. He was nice. He wasn't argumentative with him at all, argumentative, and he kept his cool, and seemed like he doesn't want to reject. He said, I don't want to reject or refuse any breathalyzer exams or anything like that. And the moment they went to cuff him, he just immediately just went off like a whole new Mr. Brooks. Now just started fighting and wrestling around. And in that process, he was wrestling with them on the ground. Like I said earlier, it looks like he hit one in the head. Looks like he hit Mr. Rolfe in the face. He grabbed their taser, Officer Brosnan's taser. He grabbed that, was warned 3 times to let go of it, let go of it, let go of it. He didn't let go. They tased him once at least, because you can see that in the video. They shot it at least once at him. That didn't seem to work. Neither did the second one if he did fire and hit him with the second time, a second round. And so as he ran off, now he has shown himself to be physical. He turns around and even fires a taser at the officer. So here's a man who has has confessed and demonstrated himself to be intoxicated and is willing to be physical. Does Officer Rolfe have reason to believe that if he got away, he would continue with he has a firearm or a taser in his hand? Could he continue to use that, especially if it has more rounds in it that he could fire at other people? We don't know. And so again, that's going to have to be hashed out in court. But the point is, this is where I'm having trouble just seeing how Officer Rolfe can be charged with felony murder. Let me add to this point here, and you may have heard other people say this. When an officer is on duty, he has a weapon. He has a firearm at his waist, on his hip. He has responsibility for that firearm. When an officer is on the scene, it doesn't matter if he has another officer there to help him. He has to defend himself, period. He can't rely on another officer to protect his safety for him. He has his own firearm. If somebody acts towards an officer in a way to incapacitate them to where they will no longer be able to control, or as one friend of mine was telling me, have domain over his weapon, he is allowed to protect himself to make sure he is able to protect and guard his firearm. If somebody acts in a way towards him that would lead to him being incapacitated to where he is now, number one, defenseless of his own safety, and number two, has a weapon on his waist that can be grabbed by a criminal, that can be grabbed and used on the officer, on people in the drive-through, to use on himself. He has the responsibility to prevent those actions from occurring to where he won't be incapacitated. And so here's Mr. Brooks firing a taser at Mr. Officer Rolfe. And I don't know if it may have another round in it. Like I said, Officer Rolfe used Mr. Brooks took Officer Brosnan's taser. Officer Rolfe used his taser, he said, twice. And so if Mr. Brooks fired it at Officer Rolfe and missed, he could possibly fire again. We don't know. If we don't know what he was going to do, that's the thing. You can't just assume he wouldn't have done that, or he would have ran off, and we don't know what he would have done. But we do know in that moment is that he was willing to fire it on an officer. And if the officer perceives, and that's what we go back up, he or she reasonably believes, that's what it's going to come down to. Did he have a right to believe that, hey man, he's shooting this taser at me, I gotta take care of this and stop this now, because this could put me out of service, so to speak. This could incapacitate me, and now I'm on the ground. I'm vulnerable to injury or death. My weapon is exposed. I can't guard that. He could grab my weapon and use that on other people, use it on me. Who knows? And so the officer's like, does he have the right then to respond and say, I have to protect my weapon because this person has proven themselves to be a threat? And that's going to come down to, because I think the prosecuting attorney, Mr. Howard, is saying that the shooting of the taser, the using of the taser, did not pose an imminent threat to Mr. Rolfe. But that's going to really be something I want to see, because I really strongly disagree with that. Now, granted, a taser itself may not be known to kill people like a pistol, like an actual firearm gun, like a gun. But there is the chance, of course, when you fire somebody, a taser at somebody, you're going to electrocute their body. And for some folks, they can go into cardiac arrhythmia, which can lead to cardiac arrest, and they can die on the ground right there just from the electrocution from the taser. Tasers can cause a whole lot of problems for people. The fact that you would shoot that at an officer shows right there that you are acting as you are willing to be violent and not care for their safety or their life, you're willing to fire on them. At that point, does an officer have the right to protect his safety? And what does that say if the answer is no? We have to think about that. And people say, well, he was shot in the back. I've seen people say, well, this man was shot in the back. Well, yeah, but you know what? It's not a crime in itself to be shot for someone to shoot you in the back. It depends on what you're doing. Shooting in the back is not an automatic incrimination of the person who shot the gun. That's just not true. Just like it's also a false statement when people are out there saying you should never shoot an unarmed man. That is phony. That is totally phony. There are plenty of times where an unarmed man can be shot at. Give you a case. Let's say let's set the situation up. Let's be realistic about it. You could have a woman officer. There's plenty of women officers out there. Let's say she's a pretty petite woman, 5'4", 130 pounds. And let's say she's, responding to a call, and she gets on the scene, and let's say she's in any situation, whatever, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be too specific. Let's say just the guy coming at her is a large man. Let's look at Hafthor Bjornsson. Let's say she's got a call where she's dealing with him, 6'8", 440 pounds. He's hauling off at her. He's got no weapon. He's just coming at her just with his fist balled up. He's ready to pound her. Well, is she not allowed to use her gun to stop him, even though he's like 4 times her size or 3 or 4 times her size? Absolutely, she's allowed to shoot him. He's an imminent threat. She has to stop him immediately. And just because he doesn't have a gun or something in his hand, she can absolutely use deadly force on something like that. Check that out. And so just pointing out that RAYSHARD was, shot in the back, or someone say he was unarmed, which he wasn't unarmed, by the way. I've seen people on YouTube comment saying that he was an unarmed man. No, he was not. He had a taser in his hand and fired it on an officer. Folks, I'm not trying to justify anybody here. I'm coming at it from the approach of this guy's already innocent in my mind and I'm going to try to justify him. No, I got to look at it for what it is. That's why I have this stuff right here. See this stuff? This is a standard to go by, people. These are standards to go by. It's called the law. If we have no law, if we have no standard, people can just throw out their opinions. Well, I think he should have done this. Well, I think he should have done that. But if we don't have a standard that determines for all of us how we're going to, evaluate these situations, then guess what? Anarchy. We're just going to have a wild, crazy society. It's going to be a horrible place to live. And we're growing that way when we get further and further away from these standards. And so what I'm trying to do is point the standard out. What's the standard say? Because that's how it's going to come down. And that's how it should be measured. These actions upon Officer Rolfe and RAYSHARD Brooks. RAYSHARD Brooks was not unarmed. He had Officer Brosnan's taser, and he used it against Officer Rolfe. Officer Rolfe drawing his weapon out and firing it at RAYSHARD Brooks, hitting him in the back. And so, was this a justified shooting? At this point, I think it is. I think he was justified to shoot Mr. Brooks. Again, the shooting is not you don't shoot to kill, you shoot to stop the threat. So make that clear with people. When you pull a gun out, the whole point is not to just kill the person. You want to stop the threat. If they die in the process, that's unfortunate. You want to make sure that you want the person to live. Nobody wants to just kill them. That's the point. We're not trying to just kill the person, but you want to use the gun to stop the threat. Now, if an officer is shooting a gun to kill the person, that's wrong. He shouldn't be doing that. And they should be held accountable for something like that if that's found to be true. But at the same time, an officer has a right to draw his weapon if he perceives a reasonable threat to his safety right here. And so that's what we want to look at. These are kind of my thoughts along the way of this case. I'm going to keep learning, keep watching, and seeing what's going on, and learn more as the process or as this case further develops. But at this point, I think felony murder is a gross overcharge. And I think at this point, as far as the shooting point, as far as was Officer Rolfe justified to draw his weapon, his firearm, his pistol, and shoot Mr. Brooks. At the point of Mr. Brooks showing his willingness to fire a taser at Rolfe, Officer Rolfe, I would say yes. I think he was allowed to do it at that point. But again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an attorney. I don't know how these things actually measure out in the courtroom. So there may be some specifics I'm just being unaware of, I'm ignorant of, and that's fine. That's why I'm going to continue to listen and learn. But I hope this is helpful for people and to look at these things here and at this kind of helps give us a little bit of focus and direction in this, instead of people just listen to the media and everything they say and just, passing around messages and hearing this from stuff. Let's go to, some actual, legal terms here, and like you say here, the Atlanta Police Department Policy Manual, Georgia Code Title 16, and look at these things and see if that helps kind of shape our thoughts and give us more of a perspective of what's the legal aspect in this. And so anyways, I appreciate y'all taking the time to watch this video. Again, this is a sad situation either way. In the end, you look at it, this guy's dead now. That's the sad part. No officer wants to, of all the officers that I know of personally, I've never heard of a single one tell me that they know of any officers who would actually look forward to going and killing somebody, because they have to go through all kinds of mess. And it's a long process that's stressful, and they do not want to go. To think that they would want to endure and go through all these things just so they can go out there and kill some guy they don't even know, just so they can say, yeah, I killed him. I really find that hard to believe, and you'd have to really do some digging on the officer to find that that's actually what he was intending to do, willing to submit through all this rigor and this examination, go through court trials, risk being thrown in prison just so he can go kill somebody because he just wants to kill a guy or a black guy or whatever. Folks, this is not what anyone wants, to see a man get shot and killed. That's not what anyone wants. And now, he's got a wife and a widow and 2 children, from what I've seen, that are without a husband, without a father at the house now. And that you can't bring that back. And so that's really unfortunate. That's probably the worst thing in this of all. RAYSHARD being killed is now, he's dead, and his kids, those little innocent children, they don't have, he can't be their dad now. He's gone. And this stuff needs to stop. Absolutely needs to stop. And so America, we need to do our best to learn how to work through this and do what we can to introspect, look at ourselves and ask ourselves, what can I do to make sure I don't wind up in a situation like this? And what can I do to teach my children to never be in a situation like this? Hey, here's how you avoid things like this, whatever. And so I appreciate you all once again taking the time to watch. I'll go ahead and stop here. Any comments, anything that I missed, please put in the comment section. I would love to hear your thoughts on this. I'd like to hear what you have to say. But yeah, justice has to prevail. And that means whether the officer is in the right, or if RAYSHARD Brooks was in the right, in that meaning that he wasn't deserving of being shot, or is what I want to say. And that's another thing. Let me make that distinction real quick. It's not that if Officer Rolfe was justified in shooting, it was not that he was required to shoot. It was that he had the option to shoot if he wanted. You can let someone kill you if you want. It's up to you. I don't want to let someone kill me. And so in a moment of imminent threat, I can choose to defend myself. And that's the point. Did Officer Rolfe have the right, a justifiable reason to choose to defend himself at that point? Which I think he did at this point. I don't see any reason. I think this was a clean shot. I think he got a clean shot. It was unfortunate. The results were horrible, but in the protection of his life, because Officer Rolfe, he's a living, breathing human being, just like RAYSHARD Brooks. Both of those men had a right to life. Neither one of them were deserving of death, unless RAYSHARD brought upon himself someone else's right to defend themselves against his actions. At that point, he was then subject to losing his life, because someone else has a right to protect their life. And if you infringe on someone else's right to life, if you start endangering those things, a person has a right to protect those things. And so we have to keep that in mind. And I hope this helps with people. I hope this helps any of y'all out at all. I'm going to continue looking at it. And again, I appreciate any thoughts that you have, and put them in the comment section below, and I will take a look at those and get to those when I can. So you all have a wonderful evening. Take care.